Welcome to Forbidden Planet TV. I'm Andrew Sumner. We've got two fantastic guests this morning. I'm very pleased to have on. We're longtime fans of their work. It's Andy Nyman and Jeremy Dyson, the co-creators of Ghost Stories. Hello, guys. And also the authors of the new novel, The Warlock Effect. So how are you both?
Very good. Very excited to be talking to you. We both absolutely love Forbidden Planet and have done since our early days when we weren't living in London. When
as long as Forbidden Planet's ever been there, I've been going into Forbidden Planet from its days on Denmark Street.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, that's something we all have in common. I love the Denmark Street store. I love the ambiance of the whole place. Obviously, it's that street is filled with history, music industry history. But it's such a great location, wasn't it?
Oh God, it was perfect. I used to come down to London, and I'd do I'd start at Forbidden Planet, and then I'd go up to Davenport's Magic Shop, which then was on Great Russell Street, and then walk along the end of Great Russell Street to Alan Allen's Magic Spot on Southampton Row. So that was, that would be like a morning, if not a day, for me.
Yeah, absolutely. Did you ever go to the Forbidden Planet 2, the store that was on the corner that was...
Yeah.
Do you remember that? And that had a different version of the Forbidden Planet poster, the famous one by Brian Bolland. And instead of the one that everybody sees, people like us, it was all made up of like old style movie stars and whatnot.
Yeah. I can remember going in there. I was a huge fan of Starburst magazine, which I used to get every month, and couldn't believe that serving behind the counter was Richard Hollis, who was one of the Starburst journalists who used to specialize in animation. And I just talking to him for about an hour, boring him senseless as a fanboy of. I couldn't believe that such a thing was possible, that you could...
the first inkling of how much money there was in journalism.
As a career journalist, I can endorse that wholeheartedly. And funnily enough, I had the same experience. I had a letter published in Starburst issue 13.
Wow.
Yeah. So which had the updated version of the John Mills version of Quatermass on the cover. And I used to do exactly the same thing, except it wasn't so much Richard Hollis I used to listen to. Alan Jones, who was like the news editor. I used to sit there pretending to go through books and magazines and just listen to the movie gossip that he had.
Loved. Well, Alan's not changed.
Yeah, no, he hasn't changed at all.
And in fact, that was one of our full circle joyous moments, was getting Alan to do all the EPK stuff on the Ghost Stories film. I mean, that was a real pinch yourself moment for us, having grown up on Starburst and Things to Come and reading their columns. And there he was on our film set. It's so special. I mean, I have got on my shelf here, I remember from the back of, here's my Starburst annual. And oh my God, I'm not going to be able to lay my hands on it. I'm ashamed of myself. My copy of Splatter Movies that I ordered, and I've still got the cutout of the address from Maya Merchandising, a little advert in the back of Starburst. I mean, it's a different world, isn't it? It's a joy.
It really is. Yeah, I remember Tony Crawley used to write the news column. Yeah, Things to Come. Absolutely. Yeah. And then the big bad reviewer in Starburst was John Brosnan, of course, the late lamented John Brosnan. Yeah. Never short of an opinion. And it was, we are not dissimilar ages, and it was hugely, hugely influential. I became a movie journalist and became a magazine publisher, and that was the DNA, that was the baseline of my whole career.
And for me too, I got bought one Christmas when I was 7 years old, a book called Movie Magic that John Brosnan wrote about special effects in the cinema. And that just set me on the path the strange winding path that I'm still on now. So these, I have an enormous debt of gratitude to all these people, because it's what happens, isn't it? Their enthusiasm and passion for what they loved is then passed on to the next generation. And but I'm me and Andy, we're both acutely aware of that you can light a fire, or that's how the fires get lit, is through passing that on.
Yeah. And it's very interesting, because just to pull it to the novel a little bit, the Warlock Effect is set in the world of British magic in the 1950s. And everything we are talking about with this never-ending youth-giving excitement, that as we all talk about it, we're so animated, and you can feel that flush of excitement still, still there, is exactly the same as magic and going into magic shops. And it's no accident that Jeremy would have gone from Forbidden Planet to Davenport's to Alan Allen's to the same dusty, cluttered, shelved, magical things that you could only get in that place. The shops that weren't corporate enterprises, that weren't about making the shareholders happy. It was solely about someone who had a passion for this stuff, thinking there are going to be other people. If there's me, there are going to be other people. Maybe I'll start a shop, and it's that thing that within the Warlock Effect is a key part of it, an unbelievably key part of the story, is this never-ending love and passion that these hobbies that maybe when you're young feel important to you but can be easily dismissed as inconsequential actually shape who you are for the rest of your life.
Yeah, I think that's very well said. Could you guys, before we go backwards and talk about the genesis of the project, could you tell me about the premise of the Warlock Effect?
Yeah, so the book introduces us to Louis Warlock, who's the kind of leading magician of his day. It's set in 1953, and he's got a hit radio show. And that's a funny thing people don't realize, but in the 1950s, magic was very popular on the radio, and many of the top magicians of the day in real life had hit radio shows. So Louis is that, and he's extraordinary, and he gets recruited or seconded into the British Secret Service because of his amazing skills, and gets pulled into a deadly espionage plot that takes over his life. So that's the kind of elevated pitch of the story, as they say.
Can I ask you about something that makes me think of, which is something that fascinates me about popular culture, is what lives on into the present day and becomes ever present, and iconic, and then the elements of our national culture that kind of get shifted to one side. And it would seem to me that growing up in the 60s, that the superstar magicians that you're talking about, like say David Nixon, who's ever present, a lot of that stuff has been forgotten in the present day. Yeah, do you have any thoughts as to why some things kind of get shunted to one side and why some things remain so incandescent?
I think specifically with magic, it's a very interesting art, and it's very driven by fashion in a lot of respects. So when you talk about Nixon was, thought of absolutely as the sort of epitome of the British gentleman magician. And when you watch him now, the magic's wonderful, but it's very gentle and it's very soft, and it's like he's your sort of favorite uncle who's doing a trick. Well, that was then smashed by Paul Daniels, who came along, and that was the first kind of, certainly in this country, cheeky chappy sort of magician. Daniels had been a door-to-door greengrocer and a grafter, and had worked the working men's clubs. And this was at the time that Wheel Tappers and Shunters was on telly, and you had the sort of tail end almost of the variety halls, but there was an edge to that, and there was a fight to that, which Daniels absolutely embodied. He's very scrappy in his early days as a performer, and it's brilliantly honed material, and that brought forward all of that stuff. And Daniels kind of, certainly here, held court until the 80s. And by then, variety had sort of died. Alternative comedy had come in, and it felt very unfashionable, very old-fashioned. The notion of the sort of glamorous assistant, dolly birds, that world just felt a bit embarrassing and not right anymore. And then it wasn't too long before you started seeing, you know, there were key players in the sort of British movement. Paul Zenon was one of those sort of slightly streety, scrappy. And then what happened was Blaine.
Yeah.
And Blaine internationally changed everything in terms of because Blaine coincided with the sort of MTV just hitting its height. And it felt like that was magic then became sort of rock and roll. It became in that very street hip hop way. And that was a seismic change that really we're still feeling the resonance of that fashion. Derren then kind of on the back of Blaine, really, Channel 4 wanted an entertainer of that field, and Derren Brown came along, and then I've worked with Derren for over 20 years, and Derren's really formed his own art form. But what I think is beginning to happen now is there's a generation, our generation, that has the feeling that we've thrown the baby out with the bathwater a bit. So when you look at Britain's Got Talent or America's Got Talent, you see there is actually a kind of a warmth for those big illusions. And there's something a bit cheesy in 80s. No one's quite cracked yet how you bring that forward. But the power of the illusions themselves is still really there. So it's a very interesting, I think that's a sort of potted history of how it sort of changed. But it's very interesting.
It reflects the wider culture, and so therefore perhaps doesn't transcend the culture that formed it in the way that, say, music perhaps can, popular music can, because it can poke out from the culture and kind of break away from the culture that formed it, and it's harder for magic to do that. I mean, that's less the case within, if you're an aficionado, if you're a magician or an amateur magician yourself, you can really admire those magicians of the past, and they don't lose their currency. You know, if you're in that insider world of magicians. So names like Di Vernon, who was known as the Professor, who was a magician from the early part of the 20th century, is still venerated today amongst magicians, even as the wider public has no awareness of him.
I had the impression that perhaps from a pop culture perspective, one of the things that affected and played into the view of magic in recent years in the UK is when mass holidays to Las Vegas via Virgin and whatnot opened up. So lots of people from the UK started flying from Gatwick to Vegas in a way they'd not been able to previously. And of course, Vegas is still full of large-scale magic acts. So, you know, from the early 2000s, and I know this happened to me, you go to Vegas and it's like, oh, wow, I can go and see these guys on stage.
Yeah.
And I think people started coming back having had that live magic experience in a way that perhaps they hadn't. Very expensive, big magic shows. You know, I remember having my mind blown by seeing a couple of them, thinking, wow, why doesn't this happen anymore? You know, and of course, now we're in a different world.
Yeah. It's very enduring. It's an enduring art, thank God.
I'd like to talk to you about the genesis of the novel, but in so doing, could we perhaps, first of all, talk about your working relationship and how Ghost Stories, which is a very successful stage show for you guys, and a kind of an indelible experience for anybody who's ever seen it, and a very successful movie for you guys. How did you guys come into each other's orbit and start working on that project?
Well, we've been very close friends since we were 15. We met at Jewish summer camp. We were thrown together by the fates in a dormitory. So we were in the beds next to one another. Andy's from Leicester and I'm from Leeds, although Andy's family is from Leeds as well, which kind of probably helped forge the bond. But we mainly bonded over horror movies, magic, and dirty jokes, and not much has changed. So that was how we met each other when we were 15. But then it took us ages to, actually for it to occur to us to work together. Although I think we were talking about it long before it happened, because we had our separate careers. Andy was an actor when I first met him. Age 15, he was an actor. He already knew that was his path. And then my writing career unfolded after I left college, and so we were on our separate career paths and enjoying success in our separate fields. And then we did start sort of saying to each other, wouldn't it be nice to do something together one day? And Andy, you can pick up that
yeah, I mean,
story.
And so we'd always said that, but I think in the way that friends often do, oh, we should do something together, it'd be great, not, and you sort of, as you're saying, you think, well, it would be nice, but when is that going to happen, especially when you're freelance. And I hadn't done a play for a decade. I'd just been doing films, and I'd come back to London to do a play, and it was a real crowd pleaser. It was a wonderful play. And it really, the bug sort of bit me to do another one. And I'd been walking through the West End, and I'd walked past The Woman in Black, which I adored. The play was just magnificent. But I sort of thought, this is mental. The thing had been on for like 20 years then. I thought, there's never been another ghost play while this has been on, because it just feels like, well, you daren't, because that's there, which felt to me like not doing another musical because Phantom's on. I mean, it just, So, and about the same time, I'd been to see the Vagina Monologues, which I didn't really love. But I did sit there and think, this is extraordinary. This thing is on all over the world. There are 3 women, no set, and they're reading it. Someone's making a lot of money out of this. And I just had this lightning strike moment where I phoned Jeremy and said, I think I've got an idea for a play we should write together. And it's basically the Vagina Monologues with ghost stories. 3 men sitting on 3 stools reading ghost stories. So that was the germ of the idea that felt, because we're both very commercially minded in so much that, we want to create the sort of things we love, which are things that have got something to say, that are passion projects, that are full of personality, but also are commercially viable. You want as many people to see it, and you want to be able to pay your bills and feed your family. So it's a sweet spot to be in if you can find it, as opposed to just being guns for hire. Yeah. Anyway, Jeremy liked the idea, and it just sort of worked timing-wise in Jeremy's life. And the guy who had directed the play that I had done, we got on very well, and he said to me, what do you want to do next? Let's work together again. I think half expecting me to say, I've always wanted to play Hamlet. And I just said to him, well, I've got this idea that me and Jeremy Dyson are working on, which is the Vagina Monologues with ghost stories. And he just went, ooh, that's really exciting. And then about a month later, he became artistic director of the Lyric Hammersmith. So I think his first phone call was to his wife, and his second phone call was to me to say, what's happening with that play you and Jeremy are writing? And I said, well, we're sort of working on it, but we're both really busy. And he's like, okay, come, I want to do a meeting. Can we have a meeting tomorrow? So we very quickly put together our rules for the play. And the rules were very simple, which were, it had to be, because you didn't want to compete with The Woman in Black, because you can't compete with it. It's the most brilliant embodiment of the Dickensian ghost story on stage. And it's just the most brilliant thing. So our rules were, you had to be contemporary. It had to be 90 minutes, no interval, straight through. And it had to deliver scares that were as good as any horror film. We couldn't be apologetic and, theatery about it, because we wanted to appeal to a young audience, a horror film audience, people who'd never go to the theatre. And we went in and told Sean that, and he said, brilliant, we'll do it. And we'll do it a year today, we'll open, and we'll do it. So we were like, hang on.
And that was the best thing about it, because it was so brilliant, because he just absolutely put us on the spot. Right? Yeah. He literally programmed it there and then, so you didn't have any choice. No. And he's right. Otherwise, we'd have been umming and ahhing and maybe next yearing about it. And
well, we tried to get out of it.
I think we did. He didn't. He wouldn't let us.
He wouldn't let us. He talked us down, as he calls it. He's like, it'll be fine. But then we were both busy. I was shooting. Campus got picked up. And I'd gone from being free to being, oh shit. And Jeremy was working on a couple of things.
I think I was doing Armstrong and Miller's show at the time.
Yeah, that was it. So we'd gone from being, we've got loads of time, to we had this 1 week window where what we thought we were going to do was we'd spend a week. I realise we're doing a lot of ghost stories talk here. We must get onto Warlock, but we'd spend a week finding what we thought the play was. Then I was going off to LA to do something. And then we'd do a bit of this sort of, we were early adopters on Zoom, and not Zoom, but versions of where FaceTime, and we'd work together. Where while I was in LA, we'd sort of try and find what the play was, and then we get back and write it. Well, in this 1 week, this 30 years of friendship at that point just vomited out of us. And the play that we basically broke down in that week is, bar some subtle changes, and, you know, is the play and the film. You know, it just...
One of my favourite things was, and it was less than a week, it was after about 3 days, Sean came round to the room where Andy's sitting now, and Andy basically performed a one-man version of it for him.
Wonderful.
It was pretty good. You'd have paid to see it, you know. It was it was one of those, as Andy said, it was 30 years pent up that just gave us that little creative volcano that doesn't happen very often in one's career, but when you get those moments, they are thrilling. And so it was like a ride, wasn't it? We got on the roller coaster.
And it's a ride that still keeps going, you know. Thank God.
I mean, it's about to go on in China again for the third time.
It's on in Mexico at the moment. I mean, it's really
so it's been all over the world, yeah.
And what was the transition into the similar but different world of the movie like?
Well, again, it's a bit of a long story, but in a nutshell, we had to wait till the rights came back to us. After
you should. It's worth. I say this because I've been doing my project review, so I was going through all the stages. It was multi-staged because we actually had an offer very early on when it first transferred to the West End. We got an approach from a studio that was very tempting, but had we taken it, you know, we'd have been sucking the devil's teat because they'd have basically just paid us for a first draft and then taken it off us.
Yeah, right.
And that didn't work out, thank God. And then, as Andy said, we had to wait for the rights to come back to us because they were tied up in the West End production. But once they did, it was Andy brilliantly, always Andy, and he's so full of self-belief. That's why for me is so wonderful to collaborate with. We were actually in Toronto. There was a production in Toronto, which was about a year after the original production, and there was interest from kind of name directors and what have you. And Andy just turned to me. We were stood in the foyer at that theatre, and Andy said, I don't want someone else to see someone else's version of it. I want it to be our version of it. If it's going to get fucked up, I want it to be us that fucks it up and not someone else. And it was so compelling. And of course, he was 100% right. That was the only way, because we loved it so much that we could have tolerated it. And so once that decision was made, then that's set in motion. But like putting together any film, you know, there are multiple hurdles to jump, and it was a process of several years to actually get it to the point where it was financed. And
the thing, Andrew, that we really try to adhere to, if for all of we are commercially minded and we want to make a living out of it, we also don't want to do that at the expense of what we believe. So an example of that would be, we'd have made much more money, if we'd have let someone else direct it, or B, we'd have, because one of the other opportunities was, we can absolutely direct it, I can play Goodman, probably move it to America, and because you'll make, you know, we'll get a wider distribution and a blah, 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 blah. And that's not what we wanted to do, because what we wanted to do, going back to what we were talking about at the beginning, was all those things we grew up on in Starburst and on BBC Two. And, you know, we wanted to make this thing that had vomited out of us, that was our love and influences and everything that has made us who we are. And that's what we wanted to do with the film. It's easier to do that with a play.
Yeah.
But with a film, when you're dealing with millions of dollars of other people's money, it's much harder and it's much more tempting to have dangled in front of you. Yeah, but you know what you'll make if it goes to America and it's successful is, you know, you'll make a couple of million quid each, maybe, as opposed to you'll get paid for doing it.
My favourite thing when we did the League of Gentlemen movie, League of Gentlemen's Apocalypse, all those years ago, and we got to the end of it, Reese said to me, he said, "We make more money window cleaning," which is actually a pretty accurate statement.
But that's the eternal conversation, isn't it? You know, between commerce and do you produce things of beauty that outlive you, right?
Yeah, and we couldn't be proud. I mean, we saw a tweet this week from someone who, the passion people have for the film and the play. It's not a small thing when you say in your introduction, it's an indelible experience if you've seen it. That's not a small thing, because there are plenty of things we all see that are delible, that just evaporate. You can't remember them, the names, the fate, none of it. So to create something that people are passionate about, it can only come from passion. And one of the things we always talk about, when we're writing Warlock, when we're writing anything, when we did ghost stories, when we list the things we love, they are all personality driven. That's why, just thinking of Tarantino, because he's 60 and he's doing the interviews at the moment. Love or hate his films, you are seeing what he loves laid out in Technicolor in front of you. Whether you like it or not, this is what he's made. And that's fantastic, because you know who he is. And that's something we really love. We do. When we're writing, we dig very deep into who we are to create not only the stories, but the foibles of the characters. They're all us. They're all versions of the things that we're scared of or going through or nervous about or love. And I think one hopes that's one of the things that makes them vibrant and alive and indelible, to use your word.
I mean, on that note, Andy, I imagine that's the glorious thing about creating the Warlock effect, is that it's all the two of you on the page. You don't have to work with an army of collaborators. So it's the pure distilled version of that, your particular vision for the novel, whatever that may be. It's there on the page. What was this spark to write the book, and how did it come about?
Well, again, it's like ghost stories. It has a long gestation. Even longer in many ways, because I think that the initial tiny little spark was about 2003. A book came out about a particular magician that was biographical, and it was sort of going through his career. And the first chapter in it had this amazing sort of set piece performance that he did, where he was challenged to find something in central London, and whilst blindfolded. And it was so vividly written. I can remember reading it thinking, God, that's like a movie. It's like Bond or something. There's definitely something in that. And then it sat there until its time and until its moment came. And then I think we did talk about it, Andy, about doing something magic based, and so it came up. But then the real thing was about just when we finished editing Ghost Stories, we just delivered the movie, and we were having the sort of fantasy conversation about, well, if it was sort of some miraculous breakout, and they'd said to you, you can do whatever you want next, what would you do? And we thought, wouldn't it be interesting if rather than another horror, it was something else that we loved, and a big adventure movie like Raiders of the Lost Ark. And then it was, hang on, what about that magician? And so we started talking it through, and we actually, so we did a fair few weeks work on it, developing it, and we sort of grew a first act. and it definitely got to the point where it was pitchable. But then we also realised it would be hugely expensive because it was period, and and it was expansive. And I think then we moved on to being more pragmatic and actually developing another horror movie. So that work sat there. And then just before lockdown, we got an approach from an editor who was a book editor who was looking for something magic based and returnable, like something you could do a series of books on. And did we have anything? And it was literally, well, it just so happens. Yes, we do. And so we sort of, well, how do we feel about taking this thing that was a film idea and actually doing it as a book? And it was, well, why not? What's wrong with that?
Let's just pause that for a second, because there was another conversation, which was me saying to you, because God bless him for your gorgeous comment about my confidence, because one of the joys of a collaboration is it's a good yin and yang is what you really want. Well, I also have terrible imposter syndrome, and one of the great strengths is Jeremy is the most brilliant writer. Brilliant. I'm in awe of his ability to write and his work ethic that he got. I don't know how people do it on their own. And Jeremy goes into that office every day and works like it's a proper job, which of course it is, But, that was one of the questions. Jeremy saying to me, we've been offered a book deal with Hodder. Do you think we should do that? And I was like, what, for a novel? And he was like, yeah. And I was like, but how are we going to do that? How do we write a novel together? Every one of my fears coming up. And it's like, and Jeremy mensch that he is like, I'll guide us, it's fine, and we'll find a way, like we found a way. It's no harder than writing a play together. It's just different, and it'll take us a week or two to find what our method is, and we'll have our usual occasional difficult conversations, and I'll basically hold your hand through the process, which he did, and made it something that wasn't truly terrifying. So it was just terrifying as opposed to truly terrifying. But I felt like I feel like I'm the winner of this process because I get to work with Jeremy in this, who is brilliant. So it's been a joy, a particular joy for me. It's always a joy because we get to spend either virtual time, which we love, or real time together. But this was particularly special.
I mean, we still had to sell it to them. So it wasn't like they just said, okay, off you go. We had to work it up as a pitch, but it wasn't hard because we'd done that work, so it unlike often writing those things can be deadly, but it wasn't in this case. It was very straightforward to just write that pitch. And and it did, I think the thing is, it was just there. Sometimes that happens. Sometimes you're sort of downloading it and that's what it feels like. I mean, obviously it's not, because you've been thinking about it for 25 years, whatever it is, or 20 years. But that was the experience. It was very fluid, I think. And then it just slotted into lockdown so well, because it was like you couldn't make anything for that, at least for that first year. You didn't know what was going on. We sadly, we were in the midst of the UK tour of Ghost Stories, and that obviously stopped, like everything stopped. So it was a perfect lockdown project for both of us, and saw us through creatively, definitely.
Given the fact that you were distilling, in effect, a lifetime of friendship, and you're focusing your mutual interests and focusing the things you've achieved in your careers, was there a euphoric element to creating this book?
Oh yeah, and it's there now, because one of the pleasures of doing it is when it comes out, getting to talk about it like this, and get it, and more than that, actually, it's the thing of the big unknown when you write a book. Is you get to the end and you've no idea what people are going to think about it. It's a real act of faith, and so fortunately, people have read it and enjoyed it and liked it, and that's the euphoric element.
They've loved it. The feedback we've had has blown us away. I mean, it is, again, like ghost stories. One of the premises was, if we were 15 and we went into the theatre, what would we want to see? Because that's no different from where we are now. We're identical people. And that's what we wrote. And this is the same. Because I'm a slow read as well. You know, if I was to read this book, what would I want? Big twists. And there are big twists in it. Cliffhangers, characters that you want to spend time with. And again, what's amazing about working in a collaboration is I feel I can talk like this because it feels like I'm not just talking about my work. When you collaborate, it sort of becomes something that is both of you and then something else. It's like this thing that has created itself through you. I know that sounds a bit wanky, but it becomes a third thing that isn't just you two. So I've just finished the audio book of it. And it was amazing. I hadn't read it for a bit, and it was amazing reading it again and just thinking, oh my God, this is a real thing. And this is it's such a rich, exciting world. Also, it's there's a love story in there as well that I think is very surprising within the book. So it was just, the feedback on it has been, and we're just at the dawn of that now. So remind me of this euphoric response when the terrible reviews start.
I think one of the things that you guys are both very good at doing is something I would describe as this is possibly a word I've made up, which is subliminality. So what you're right, you work with Derren, you work with the League of Gentlemen, you work on ghost stories. One of the ways in which it operates, as the audience either at home or in the theatre is, there are things that you're seeing that are operating on your subconscious and discomforting you, right? And then they pay off, kind of later on down the line in ways that you're not expecting, you're not even always aware of in real time. But afterwards, when you think about it, it's like, oh, wait a minute. And I was wondering if there's traces of that approach within the novel, or whether that's something it's very difficult to achieve on the page.
Oh, no, it's very definitely in the novel. Very definitely, in quite a lot of ways. In fact, one of the things that people are starting to ask me at the moment is, should I read it or get the audio book? And the one thing I would say is, if you get the audio book, you miss out on a very beautiful magic trick that is buried in the novel. That is a twist that is exactly what you're talking about, that operates in a subliminal way that has a very special effect when you get to the end of it. So no, it's something we're very conscious of. And a word that Jeremy reminded me of, that is something that has become quite acute in our world, I think, is there's a sort of a disquiet, an uncanny. There are words that really help embody when you're just not feeling settled, either as a protagonist, as a character, or as a reader or a viewer. You want to kind of dial up certain things that make people feel like that. So it's something that I think it's fair to say, Jez, we are conscious of, aren't we?
Yeah, again, because it's something that we enjoy very much ourselves. So I think that's why we're seeking to put it into the work. It's that same principle of if we were watching this or reading this, what would we want to see or read? Yeah.
And without revealing any of that stuff at all, I'm fascinated in what your process is when you work together, because quite often when I look at your joint work and the elements we've just talked about come through, I'm always fascinated by how you actually put that together, because it strikes me it's the kind of thing that it's particularly suited for writing partnerships rather than just coming from one brain alone. Because the thing about a trick, you've got to sense check it and look at it from a number of angles. And I'm fascinated what your process when you're writing the Warlock Effect. How did you actually do it? in terms of how did you put the drafts together? Some writing teams write literally 1 page on, 1 page off. How did you put the book together?
Well, it's a very fluid process. It's the same process as the other stuff that we've done, which is there's a lot of talking, and the talking is probably the bigger part of it in many ways, because we both love digging into ideas and going deep with them, and personal stuff and going deep with that. So that's the wider context. And then there's a lot of writing bits, and then passing bits back and forth and editing each other's material, and so it's very fluid, and it accumulates in that way, and then it gets polished as it goes through all these different processes. So you become this gestalt, and as Andy said, and it was the same. It was the same on Ghost Stories, the play and the film. Is you set out with an idea of where you want to go, but you don't have to know how you're going to get there. So there's a lot of stepping out in faith, and then trusting the process as you go, and it telling you. And the one of the privileges of any collaboration, and I learned this on the League as well, was, if you're going to make it work, you have to park any sense of, oh, I did that at the door. Yeah, it goes. Any ego. If ego creeps in, it kills it. So the minute you've decided to collaborate, you just commit to it, and it doesn't matter how you get there. You just get on with it, and you trust each other, and you trust the process, and keep your eye on where it is you're aiming for.
That's very interesting. Is the world of Warlock, the universe of the Warlock Effect, is that something that you can continue with beyond this first novel?
Oh yeah,
I hope so, because we signed a 2-book deal.
Well, there we go. Are you already working on the next one?
Yeah, we started talking and thinking about it.
Yeah, we're definitely talking about. I mean, we have a broad idea of the second book, and potentially the third book, of where we're interested in those worlds going. So yeah, but there's a lot in that world for us. Yeah.
Yeah. And how elastic is the concept as far as you guys are concerned with regard to other media? I mean, is it something that could translate into comic books? Can it translate into movies and TV?
Yes, it could definitely translate into comic books. Yes, it will definitely translate into TV. Can't say any more.
Right on. Yeah, say no more. And before we part, guys, by the way, everybody watching this, the Magnificent Warlock Effect is available from the links attached to our conversation right below the screen here. And before we part, can you give me a flavour of what else you guys are working on at the moment?
Yeah, I've got a couple of things. So I've recently finished a series for Disney Plus called A Small Light, that's about Anne Frank, but seen through the eyes of a girl called Meep, who was the girl who basically would bring them food and engineered so much. She was Otto Frank, Anne's father, asked her, he was her secretary, and asked her. It's a really brilliant story that people don't really know, and so that comes out in Disney Plus in May. And then myself, Derren Brown, and Andrew O'Connor, who is the third wonderful cog in that system, the three of us are creating, writing and directing a brand new magic show called Unbelievable, which opens in, I think, August in Colchester, and then comes into the West End in September. Plus the other things Jeremy and I are working on. So it's a pretty full diary.
Is that the same Andrew O'Connor who used to be appearing on The Waterfront decades ago? That Saturday morning kid?
Yes.
Yeah, he did the dub of the Flashing Blade, right? Yeah.
Wow. Yeah, and he was.
Yeah,
I mean, he's had an amazing career, Andrew.
Yeah.
He was Young Magician of the Year. Then he was an impressionist. Then he started creating game shows and chain letters, and he's had an amazing career. Fascinating. He's alongside Jeremy Dyson. He's my other best friend.
Yeah. Oh, wonderful. Absolutely wonderful. Yeah. And guys, I really appreciate you coming on to talk about the Warlock Effect, which we're massively excited about at Forbidden Planet. And if what in an ideal world, what would you like people to take away from the book?
Well, I think there's a couple of things. I mean, one is just the thrill and love of the world of magic, but also I think me and Andy, when we're working together, if we're trying to write about anything, it's about what matters. And what matters it isn't to be found in the material world or the materialistic world that we inhabit now. It's found in friendships and in relationships and how we relate to other people. And I think that's, if we have something that we write about, that's it, and we keep looking at that from a different angle, and certainly that that I hope is one of the things you'll take away from the book is how important those friendships, those relationships are in life.
Yeah, I couldn't say it better than that. It's perfect.
I think, guys, that's a beautiful note to end on. And thanks so much for sharing the time. The Warlock Effect is available to order below, and everybody should be very excited because it's wonderful hearing you guys talk about it. Yeah, and I can't wait to see what else you do with it and to do with the Warlock universe. That's amazing.
Thanks, Andrew. We love Forbidden Planet, so thank you for having us.
And we love you guys, so thanks for coming on. Yeah, take care of yourselves, and I'll see you soon. All the best. If you're enjoying watching Forbidden Planet TV and you're enjoying watching us talk to the world's most interesting and accomplished filmmakers, authors, artists, musicians, creators, subscribe right here. See you soon.